Thank you very much for inviting me. I think the subject you've chosen for this conversation is very important. Civil society, the new frontier of war. Uh, Now, I think we need to understand, which I think all of us do, because the role of civil society in democracies has now become a matter of debate and concern. Um, I've always been a little doubtful about the concept of civil society in democracies. After all, democracy is for the people, by the people, or whatever else. And you have uh, elections, people are constantly consulted. And elections can be pretty tough. Um, there is an independent judiciary, there is a free press. There are political parties, which means several political parties, which means that you have political choice. So you have many platforms on which you can express your thinking and views, and at election time, you make your political choice. So why do we then talk about civil society in a democracy? Uh, Essentially, it is a concept that comes from the West, from the United States in particular, as also Europe. Now, is it because many believe that now there is a gap between the public and governance in these countries? In other words, there is a feeling that the government elected democratically does not truly represent the voice of the people. So there is a bit of a crisis in democracy, in Western democracies. And the civil society, therefore, has organized itself uh, to uh, make the government more aware and influence its policies in the directions they want. Of course, this is abused a great deal, even in the West, because the civil society is used even internally in the government, like the United States, by the intelligence agencies to promote a certain line of thinking. On the other hand, the civil society can play a positive role too, because at the end of the day, the government machinery is not so vast, and everybody in the government is not so well informed and has the time to look deeply into various governance issues, and therefore there can be well-meaning civil society groups, NGOs, uh, who can study the subjects in depth, make recommendations. It's up to the government to accept them or not. On environmental issues, climate change issues, women-related issues, some ground level work in terms of alleviating poverty, in terms of education, in terms of creating better awareness of in the people at large about their their needs and how they can address them and approach the government in a democratic manner to address their problems. Now, India has the highest number of NGOs in the world. Um, on the other hand, and this is where India's concerns come in, so long as we have civil society organizations which are grassroots organizations which don't have a visible anti-government revolutionary kind of an agenda, like the Maoists or the certain leftist groups which believe in anarchy, or who want to promote religious violence, things like that. But if the civil society groups function normally as positive elements in a society in terms of um, creating greater awareness of issues and influencing government policies in a constructive manner, that's one aspect. But from our point of view, many of these NGOs very important ones, significant ones, capable of influencing policy, are financed externally. I've always asked myself, why is it that the government accepts foreign funding of NGOs, of civil society groups? We have experience of this. We know what the agenda of organizations like the Ford Foundation or the Rockefeller Foundation or the Open Society or Omidyar Foundation, and a whole host of organizations which are involved in funding civil society groups in India in order to advance their agenda. Why do they want to do that? I mean, what is their interest in financing NGOs in India? Now, what part of the answer is that this is one way of creating pressure on the government, as you mentioned, interfering in their development plans. That we've seen that the kind of protests that occurred at Kudankulam, they were clearly manipulated from outside. One of the reasons is that they want to have a handle to be able to influence the government on issues in which they have interest. Or for that matter, have a handle on the government in order to keep the government on the defensive constantly, create pressure points, and make the government more amenable to their suggestions and advice and everything else. Today, these countries cannot occupy territory. The days of colonialism are over. The physical occupation is not possible, but mental occupation is possible. And the purpose of civil society is to control the thinking and analysis that go on in terms of understanding issues. So it is a way for the West to retain hegemony and control. It's much easier in democratic societies. I mean, they've done it elsewhere, and I'll come to that. Even in closed societies, they've done it. But in open societies like India, especially with the English language that people in India are speaking and have access to, it's very easy then to penetrate the Indian society. Whatever is written there, whatever documentation comes from there is read. If it came in Chinese or Russian, they won't be able to make the same impact on the ground. But when it comes in English, very easy. And then on the internet and everything else, you access materials that come from there because you know the English language. You can easily access all this and then feel enriched with ideas, with concepts. Because we are, as a country, we have been quite dissociated with our own past and our own concepts and everything else. So we very easily imbibe the concepts that come from others. One of the dangers that I see, and we must be very conscious of this, and unfortunately, our Supreme Court seems to be a prey to this, is this wokeism business. This whole wretched wokeism business, which is a huge problem in the education system, even in the West, even in Europe. I remember a couple of years ago, French President Macron, by speaking somewhere, he made a statement that I have instructed the French education minister to look at what's happening in the universities, because many of these ideas that are coming from the West about minorities, about gender stuff, about questioning history, questioning the heroes of the past and everything else, is highly disruptive, and it's not in consonance with French culture. Now, even if a country like France feels threatened by these wokist ideas, you can imagine the danger that we are in. And here I'd like to say that, to my mind, government has to be very careful in its new education policy. It is allowing Western universities to come and set up shop here. I have absolutely no problem if technology related institutes are set up here. Absolutely no problem. But Liberal arts, no. That is the source where they can control the thinking of your youngsters, of your university students, and everything else. You've seen what's happening in the American universities and now in European universities. It can happen in India too, because the instruments, the toolkits are the same, and the external flow of external influences are the same. And children tend to be idealistic and everything else, so they can be excited by what might look like a very positive agenda, but in fact would be inherently quite destructive. The other purpose of the West funding these organizations is to dilute the government, control of the government over policy, and using the civil society to shape policy. We see this in international organizations. Earlier on, it was always government to government level negotiations. Now there's this concept of stakeholders. So the civil society comes in large numbers, so that they can then influence decisions which have a global impact, and force you to accept things which as a nation you may not be very comfortable with, because all these NGOs all over the world are part of the official multilateral discussions. So this is one way in which the West again has used the civil society as an instrument to advance their global agenda. And then they have organizations like Freedom House, which, as you know, very close links with the CIA, and this VDEM from Sweden, or Amnesty International, or Human Rights Watch, or this US Commission on International Religious Freedoms, and organizations like that. They again are the source of influencing the internal situation in countries like India. And you've seen the kind of campaign that is being conducted against India for a long time, and more particularly recently, including during election time. Now, if we were impervious to this, or largely if we had some kind of a barrier to this, I can understand. But it's not the case. We have elements in India actually who are hands in glove with these organizations and amplify whatever they say. The smallest criticism of India, the smallest statement made by the State Department becomes news in our papers. Our papers will give front page coverage to any criticism that is made of India, instead of objecting to this or giving counter argument, which they don't. They project it as if it's the white man has spoken, and therefore it must be true. This is another handle that these people have. And then there is the press, whether it is the New York Times, Washington Post, or the Economist, or Financial Times, or the Wall Street Journal, or Le Monde. Just look at what they write about India and the issues that they pick up, and the issues, and it is destructive uh, uh, without limit. And sometimes I ask myself, what is the concept these people have of their role as journalists? It's not that they need to be the spokesman of the government of India, but they need to be at least minimally objective. But they're absolutely not. And therefore, they project constantly a negative view of India, of backsliding of democracy, of minority persecution, of lynching, of capture of institutions, or curbs on the judiciary, curbs on the press, and everything else. This is the constant refrain. And it does damage to India. Let's not be oblivious to this. It does do damage to India, because an ordinary person, enlightened person who's aware of the international situation, and I've seen this in my experience, those who don't specialize in India, let's say, they just read this stuff and they form a view. And since most of the time it's the Indians who are writing this stuff, so I mean, therefore, I suppose they think that, well, if this is being said, there must be some truth in this. And it's very difficult for the government to counter this. Same is true of the TV channels. The France 24 that I occasionally see just to see what the negative twist they give to India news, or this German Deutsche Welle or whatever. The European, mind you, we don't pay too much attention to the European press. It's more focused on the US and UK press. But the European press follows the same line. Nothing positive about India largely. Then, uh, there is this whole discourse of democracy, values, and human rights at the official level in the West. That is also a way to influence the civil society here, because the civil society is receptive to any criticism that comes from the West about democracy backsliding. And of course, you want to measure up to the Western values, and you don't want to be seen as a violator of human rights. And there are issues in India which you can always play up, whether it's in Jammu and Kashmir or caste issues or minority issues. You can always, in our fractured society, raise these issues, and are being raised, and they are being raised. The thing is that the civil society here, with the encouragement of the West, gets more oxygen to raise these issues. Now, I was talking of wokeism. I was very surprised at the recent judgment of the Supreme Court in this case of a 14-year-old girl who was raped, and there was this abortion case where 42 times they referred to her as a pregnant person. And the Supreme Court and Chief Justice made the argument that there can be cases of transgender men or non-binaries also becoming pregnant, and therefore we want to have neutral language. Now, what kind of nonsense is this? Utter nonsense. And here it's not a question of civil society being, or maybe it is. Maybe the Supreme Court is sensitive to these kind of debates in civil society and want to be seen in tune with these debates. And this shows the direction in which we can go if we are not careful. Now, finally, FCRA restrictions. No, let me, before that, talk about social media also, because apart from everything else that I've mentioned, social media is a very powerful instrument for conditioning thinking. Now, in India, people on social media, we are the biggest users of American social media. And when we remember, our population is 1.4 billion. And if 80-90% or 700-800 million, 900 million have access to the internet and smartphones, so you can imagine the kind of conditioning that can be done. And the government is not in a position to control this. Yes, in very exceptional cases, they ask these people to put down certain posts and this and that and that, but that's a long process. And that process itself is problematic, because then we are criticized for curbing freedom of speech. The whole freedom of speech debate then enters into this. And the government, therefore, has to be very careful in not being seen to be curbing speech, because the youngsters are now very sensitive to this, and they want to have access to this media. And even more than the written press and television and everything else, the social media is a huge source of influencing the younger minds of the people. The other thing I want to mention is what we have seen, and we have to be careful about this, what the United States in particular, and with the help of Europe, but the United States in particular, has done in terms of regime changes. Now, in Ukraine, there has been a huge, long-standing project of regime change, this color revolution. In Georgia, this happened. The whole Arab Spring, it was Freedom House and the National Endowment of Democracy of the United States and others were deeply involved in this. And whereas, of course, in a functioning democracy like ours, with a popular leader and the progress that we are seeing on the ground, It is not possible to manipulate the Indian electoral system to this extent or the Indian public to this extent. But nevertheless, the concerted campaign that we've seen during this election points in this direction. That even if we can't dislodge Modi, let's see if he can somehow help in reducing his majority so that he becomes more manageable and India becomes more manageable. And India doesn't have that kind of liberty of maneuver, which a huge Modi victory would give India. So I was coming to this FCRA restrictions. That itself has become a bit of an issue. I'm personally very glad that the government has taken decision to withdraw the license of hundreds and hundreds of organizations, which itself shows that there were hundreds of organizations which were doing work at the behest of foreign interests. And I was amazed that 80% of the funding of CPR, which is now being projected as a major Indian civil society organization or whatever, 80% of the funding was coming from outside, foreign. Why? And how come CPR acquired such great influence with foreign funding? And why did they need foreign funding? If they were doing such good work, they should have been funded from inside. I have been reading for a long time Rajiv Malhotra's books about breaking India and snakes in the Ganga, and he brings out very well the dangers that lie ahead. So, how should I conclude? I'll conclude by saying a few things. One, that this FCRA business, the licensing under that has to be controlled more and more. We shouldn't bother about what the West feels. The Americans I've served there, I know how utterly sensitive they are on issues of foreign funding. And anybody who receives money from abroad has to be declared a foreign agent, which then means that a whole set of different rules apply to that organization. We've not gone that far, but we have to be very careful because we have a lot of social fractures in our country, and they can be exploited, and it'll take time for us to resolve those issues. We must build up our own social media. Chinese have done that, but the Chinese system allows it. In our case, I think we have now too much, our foot is too much deep into the Western social media system to be able to develop an alternative one. But nevertheless, we should move in that direction, and we should have our national laws and robustly apply them, and not accept the fact that since they are controlled from outside, that sovereignty on these issues lies with them and not with us. It may be an unpopular thing, but I hope with Modi's big success, we will have the self-confidence to go down the road. We should not allow liberal arts colleges of the West to install themselves here and condition the mind of our youngsters, and this is going to be a big problem for us in the future. And we should also, it's a bold thing, I think we should deal more robustly with the foreign press, the correspondents in India, who are systematically creating misperceptions about India with their narratives, including this Washington Post latest venture into the Panun affair, where they were actually trying to contact our former raw officers and also track this Vikram Yadav, which is a clear interference in our internal affairs. But beyond that, it is a kind of spy work on behalf of intelligence agencies. It merited him to be expelled. Of course, we won't do that. But the point is, there has to be. Now, when this Australian journalist was, actually, she was given the visa at the last minute, but the entire foreign correspondent press corps signed a petition on a small issue like this, where the facts were not against the government, but they did it. So they are getting too big for their feet. Sorry for the language, but I think something needs to be done to control them. Anyway, it's not easy what I'm saying, because at the end of the day, we also want to maintain our image of a democracy. And we use the language of democracy, the fact we are the largest democracy in the world, and that we share the same values. We use this as a diplomatic tool in our relations with the West. And we think it's an argument which would help us economically too. So we are caught between two storms: how to keep projecting ourselves as an open liberal democracy and also protect ourselves because there are a lot of enemies within and without. Thank you.